Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. So, part of my job is to ask a lot of questions. Some, I have to admit, are repeated frequently, but the goal is to get as diverse a collection of responses as possible in order to accommodate different opinions, experiences, work environments, or applications. These questions also help set the stage for follow-up questions that hopefully offer additional perspective. The other commonality found in many of my questions is that they lead to discussions of problems, challenges, or cybersecurity mistakes that can or have had highly negative impacts on key organizations. While there might be a pattern to my process, there's also a method to my madness, because in my opinion, we have to continue to ask questions that simultaneously tackle the simple blocking and tackling issues of cybersecurity while also preventing us from putting our heads in the sand and trying to ignore the shortcomings of our current strategies. I'd argue that a great deal of positive outcomes couldn't be realized without repeatedly asking questions and not being afraid of the potential findings. I also think our guest for today's episode would agree with that. It's my pleasure to welcome Jeremiah Fowler to Security Breach. He's a leading cybersecurity researcher who has a wealth of knowledge on the industrial threat landscape and recently uncovered a data vulnerability that, left unmended, could have had far-reaching and highly damaging impacts. Jeremiah, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to Security Breach. I think the best place to start before we get into the real specific reason you're joining us today is maybe you can just tell us a little bit about you and the role that you play in cybersecurity right now.
Sure. So I am a cybersecurity researcher. I've been doing this for about 10 years now. And the irony is I got into cybersecurity through a data breach. So I worked for a company that they did outsourcing, and they also had an antivirus and anti-theft tool. And we had a data breach of around 15 million customers. And and it was devastating, because you have your internal team and then you hire outside people to do penetration testing, and somehow they missed it. And when the security researcher found it, and they reported it publicly first. And the good part and the bad part is we had the files encrypted, but we used an old algorithm, so the security community still pulled us through the ringer. Owners of the company, to make a long story short, really awesome guys. They gave me the budget and the freedom to create a research center, and the idea was to try to find data breaches, what causes them, and then eventually we were going to try to develop some sort of product or service to help companies that actively have a data breach or help them recover. Now, later, the company went a little more public. They hired some big shots from some of the corporate American software companies. And the first thing that the new COO said was, what's your ROI? And we said, we're helping people. And they closed us down. So, and that's when I went independent, because I loved cybersecurity. I loved the freedom of in those days it was the golden era, so it was treasure hunting. And I've seen millions of credit cards, I've seen millions of hospital records, I've seen anything you can think of. I've probably seen it.
That's insane. So as a researcher, what is your goal? For lack of a better term, is it to just expose or to shed light, I guess would be the better way to put it, to shed light on some of these hacks that are not being made public? People are afraid to really let things out and be more open about them. Is that kind of your goal? And then try to learn from those situations, or what is it?
Yeah. So with what I do, I mostly do data research. So when I find, like, let's say an exposed cloud storage repository, A lot of times I can see all of the middleware they're using. I can see encryption keys, private keys. I can see if files are encrypted or unencrypted. And so what I like to do when I find that, it's not about naming and shaming that company because I know from experience accidents happen. It's about learning from that, and not just you learning from that and your company learning from it, your industry. Um, because and I forget the exact number of the statistic, but a company that has a data incident, it's something like 70 or 80% won't have one in the next like 3 to 4 years. And that's because finally the senior management, the C-level executives, they provide the resources where they belong. Because I say this all the time, it's almost like my mantra. Companies that provide a product or service, the data you collect and store of your customers is equally as valuable as the products or services you provide. And many companies don't realize that until it's too late. So that's kind of my take on it. So, one, find and identify exposed data. And then two, give a real world example of what criminals can do with that data once it's out there, and hopefully plug the gap and raise awareness and help identify issues that, if someone can look at one of my discoveries and my description and then help protect their environment or their client's environment, then, I go to sleep pretty easy at night doing that. So,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in the industrial sector. One of the issues that we still come across is we have a lot of individuals, whether it's on the plant floor, in the IT department, or even in the executive suite, the CISO type station. They understand the issues. They're still struggling, however, to get funding. They just can't get, whether it's the board or the people that control the purse strings, to really divert a lot of resources to cybersecurity. Has there been anything that you've seen, whether it's messaging or tactics or approaches, whatever the case may be, to help reinforce the need for those funds throughout the enterprise?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the average cost of a data breach now is in the millions of dollars. And there's no real way to measure the lost trust because, that's the big thing too. And depending on how sensitive your customer's data is, and especially like in an industrial space, or like, let's say you are a CRM or CMS provider. So you're dealing with like multi-tiered data. You're dealing with companies that use your product or service, and then the end customer. So you can have, some of the biggest, most diverse data breaches I've ever seen were from, companies that provided the CRM, or, a type of service that manages the data of many different businesses. My advice would be to bring in the C-level executives, or whoever's controlling the purse strings, because ultimately, if they understand the risk and they understand not to put all your eggs in one basket, understand that the vendors you use or the third-party contractors you use, you lose control of that data. Make sure they have a really big insurance policy, because no one wants to be on the hook for providing, you know, lawsuits, or if you have to provide credit monitoring or anything like that. So helping the top executives fully understand that there is a real world cost to making sure that data is secure. That's step one. Some people get it, some people don't.
Yeah. Well, I think, connecting the dots here with the OT security space that we really target our audience with, there's always that place where you have to start. And we've seen this in a lot of big industrial organizations. They start on the IT side with a lot of these software platforms, ERP being a huge part of the manufacturing enterprise or the industrial enterprise. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is you came across a really interesting breach that centered around an ERP company, ClickBalance, based out of Mexico. And well, I'll kind of let you take it from there, Jeremiah. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you discovered this situation and what it all turned into.
Yeah, so and that's the thing. There are many smart people all around the world. I've worked in, actually I live in Europe now, but I lived in Ukraine. And we're just talking about Mexico is becoming an outsourcing hub, the same way that Ukraine was an outsourcing hub, because young, smart people realize that you can control your destiny, work how you want, and you don't have to go through this traditional bureaucratic layers of a real world business. And so IT is really something that you can do from anywhere in the world. When I'm looking for data, the first thing I do is I see what it is, and then I try to validate the finding. And I'm always looking for data. So when I found this, I saw that there was just under like a billion records. I think it was 769 million. And inside of that, there were like 380 something thousand email addresses. And that opens an entire can of worms because one of the biggest risks right now to security, yes, of course, ransomware, of course, malware, but social engineering is a huge issue. And especially when you're talking at a corporate level, if you're going through and you're looking and researching who are the key players, who are the top people, who has access to what, and if you target them, you already have their email address, you already have internal data, you already have many of the tools you need for a successful social engineering campaign. And so when I find it, I try not to leave a database open for long. I really try to, I never download the data I find. I try to do like a limited sample of everything, get a real understanding of what's there, and then I send a responsible disclosure notice. So in this case, I sent the responsible disclosure notice. They closed it down immediately. It's not uncommon, but I didn't hear anything back. And there's many reasons for that. Some companies just want to put their head in the sand. Some companies just don't trust. They're like, oh no, I'm not falling for this
Yeah.
scam. They hacked us.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've heard this before, and that's unfortunate that we live in that world where fear dominates response, but it doesn't help your customers and it doesn't help your data. Having a good response plan, because I'm here to tell you, doing this for 10 years, it's not if you had a data incident, it's when. And being proactively prepared is just as important as having a response plan, because then you're not running around blind. You know who's responsible for what's your messaging going to be, your key stakeholders you have to reach out to. And so I don't really know the fallout of that. And they've been in business for 25 years. I saw a lot of IP addresses from the United States, Canada, and with free trade and the networking between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and probably around the world. Who knows what, how big they were, or the outreach that they had to their customers.
Well, 769 million records tells you they have quite an extensive reach and into a lot of different industrial sectors, or different sectors, I should say, business areas. Do you know what vulnerabilities were exploited, how the hacker was able to get in and steal this much data?
Well, this was a misconfigured database. So, as to the best of my knowledge, no hackers were in there
Oh, okay.
yet. But
Okay.
But in the limited sampling of documents that I saw, I did see access keys, I saw secret keys, I saw things that if the bad guys got, they could dig much deeper because, in my case, when I find a non-password protected database, um, even if I see passwords and everything there, I never use them. That's the whole point of being an ethical researcher, is you never bypass credentials. But the real concern here is companies that provide a service, and this is a very valuable service. It helps companies with their billing, with their inventory, uh, invoicing. So this is a very valuable service that the industrial sector needs. But what happens is when you have an application or you have a dashboard, all of those files have to be stored somewhere. And the problem is where you run into getting from point A to point B. So a lot of times they'll be stored in a cloud storage repository, and the whole database will be password protected, but the individual files are open so they can be delivered through the dashboard. And the problem with that is once you see that file path, you can track it back. And then 9 times out of 10, you can see every document that's in the entire database.
Wow. So when you say misconfigured, this was just basically there weren't the layers of security that would be necessary to protect all this individual data.
No, not at all. Yeah,
Wow.
it was completely open. I mean, anyone with an internet connection could have seen it if they knew where to look.
So is this something that you see a lot of? Is it just one of those things where why would somebody target us, or is it just maybe I'm not trying to really get after click balance here, but is this sort of a sloppy lack of segmentation? Was this just not doing their homework? What kind of proliferates
No,
this type of
there,
situation?
there's a big range of why this could happen. So, I can't when a company doesn't comment, they don't put their side of the story forward. That's the thing. And like I said, mistakes happen to my company. And the thing is to learn from that and to grow from that. I've seen databases from Fortune 100 companies that were also misconfigured. It's not as common now, but it could happen because, let's say, someone changed the firewall setting. During COVID, when everyone was working remote, I saw a tsunami of exposed data breaches because so many employees needed to work remotely, they needed access. So by giving one person access, you made a mistake and gave everyone access. And it was a gold mine for whoever's taking data. And there are nation states that are actively harvesting data. So that's the real risk also. you know, yes, an ethical security researcher found it, notified you, did the right thing, but you don't know who else got it or what they can do with it in the future.
Yeah. So, what are the biggest lessons that you hope companies take away from these situations? Is it a lot of the simple stuff, a lot of the blocking and tackling, like I always talk about, or are there bigger measures here, bigger problems that we're just not addressing?
I mean, we could talk about that all day. A lot of times the company will get one vendor and they'll get the cheapest guys they can get or someone that has a good brand name and they'll get just an automated penetration test or something. And so any provider can give you, 200 pages of false positives. But if you don't have multiple vendors, an internal team poking, prodding, looking, making sure that your patch management's up to date, making sure all of your software is up to date, and then educating everyone in your team. I have seen some of the biggest data breaches that were because of either HR people or C-level executives. And, these are very non-technical people, but they need access to very sensitive data. And that's another thing that I preach all the time is give data a life limit, a term limit, similar to what we need in Congress, but I'll let that go for another time. But if you give that data a time limit and control who accesses it and for how long, then you're kind of a step ahead of the curve. So then if a C-level executive says, "Hey, I need this, this, and this, and this," open it up for them for 48 hours. And then, if their email gets hacked or something else happens, they lose a laptop, then you don't have to worry about access to that because it's closed down. So monitoring your ports, regular penetration testing, not putting all of your eggs in one basket with one vendor if your budget allows. These are all things that can help, but you have to understand you put locks on the front door of your office. You put security cameras up, and then to not do the most basic data protection methods really makes no sense, especially in this day and age with so many different options.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about the basics, one of the things that the industrial sector in particular struggles with is just visibility of the attack landscape and understanding, man, I've created all of these new connection points with all this new Industry 4.0 technology that we brought in, and there's just we don't always understand how everything is connected and all those different points that could be weak spots that hackers could probe and take advantage of. What would be your advice there? I mean, it seems like a very leading question, kind of, but what's your advice there in helping to improve that visibility and not just obtain it, but then being able to act on it, because it can also become real overwhelming very, very quickly, and we know what that leads to.
Yeah, absolutely. And very as you were saying that, it reminded me of the medical industry. And I'm not familiar with a lot of the like IoT devices that are used, but I'm sure they're there. And many of those were made with obsolete operating systems that was never designed to be updated, to have security software or anything like that. And that is a backdoor into your network. And, even from my research on some of the hacktivists and all of that, if they get in a backdoor, it's so easy to jump from device to device to device. And I mean, even if you know IP addresses, you can spoof that IP, fool your system that it's, a legitimate user, brute force your way in, and now, you've got ransomware or, whatever method they choose to use. Educating your team, educating the people who usually only care about the bottom line. Those are your target, because it's not, cybersecurity is not this far away story, this legend of Bigfoot. Everybody talks about him, but nobody sees him. It is detrimental to your business, and it can have a catastrophic effect on your business. Not just the bottom line, but the trust that you've worked hard to build can all be wiped away in an instant if you suffer a ransomware attack or have a data breach.
Yeah. So, I feel like our audience we've gotten past sort of a lot of that low hanging fruit. If we're past step one, if you will, in terms of understanding our threats, we understand our connection points, we understand what's out there, but it's that next step, because I think to your point, well, we've done all of this stuff, we should be good. What have you seen as maybe being that next step then to really make sure your enterprise is as secure as it can be, understanding it's an ongoing battle. You're never really done. But what is maybe that good second step that folks can look to take?
Honestly, the human factor is everything. I think some FBI statistic last year was like 98% of cyber incidents happen through human interaction, social engineering. I do consulting sometimes, and we've run tests on companies, and we tried to make it fun. We didn't name them and shame them, but we cloaked emails. We sent them with, phishing links, and you would be amazed at the people that fall for that. And these are good, educated people. The thing is, especially with artificial intelligence, a few years ago, when you got the email that your uncle from Nigeria died and left you his lottery winnings, or, some beautiful woman is trapped somewhere and they took her passport and she only needs $500 to come marry you. Um, a very small number of people fell for that. But you could look at the grammatical mistakes. You could look at, whatever email account they had used. It was very, very easy to identify. And I've seen some of the ways that, especially some of the scammers, are using AI for crypto scams and different things. It's indistinguishable. I mean, especially because it's written near perfectly. People in our industry, we're suspicious of everything. So I'll send you to one of my websites that has a tracking pixel and see where you really are, unless you're using a VPN. So the average person just working their job, doing their day-to-day life, being aware and understanding that threats are out there and they're coming, and you are the weak link. Like, human error is the weak link. We know for a fact that there is no such thing as perfect. Every system can be compromised, like almost guaranteed. Like even blockchain, and it may take some time in a supercomputer, but even blockchain can be compromised. So there is no bulletproof vest for cybersecurity. The human factor really is the most dangerous part. And it reminds me of this. It's been probably 2 or 3 months ago, and it was in Hong Kong. So, someone in the financial world had a call with some executives that were all deep fakes. And the guy transferred a few $1 million thinking that he was in a meeting, and they, had socially engineered him for who knows how long. And he literally sat in a meeting, like a Zoom meeting, with these deep fake videos of executives and transferred a few $1 million.
That is
So
incredible.
the
Wow.
human factor, it's the biggest risk. No matter how intelligent technology is, software can only do what it's programmed to do. If you don't combine that with human logic, you're really missing the target.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of times it's not about naming and shaming, which I agree with 100%, but we also want an element of transparency when these hacks do occur so we can learn from it, we understand what's out there, not glorify the hackers, but expose them a little bit too as to who they are. How do you as a researcher sort of walk that line between not pointing out all the negatives and the punitives that this company did wrong, but also bringing it to light so we as an industry can learn?
Like I said, I've been doing this for around 10 years, and I started during the golden age of the bug bounties. And
Yeah.
and honestly, it was awesome. And I'm not just saying that because I earned money from bug bounties. The company understood that the more outside eyes, the more talented people from around the world that you can bring to look at your network, to look at your infrastructure, to identify a weakness, the better off you are. And they used to really reward that. And I mean, companies big and small. And now, the thing is, when the company understands that data is their business, or a core part of their business, and they have a bug bounty program, it not only welcomes legitimate white hat members of the security community, it also encourages the bad guys to do the right thing if they find it. And, I started recommending this to consulting clients years before I ever saw it. In every database you have, no matter where it's segregated, put a text document in there with the details of your bug bounty, all of the direct contacts, so it doesn't go to your customer support. It's like, yeah, whatever. And that's an epic fail for a company that doesn't have a communication channel for data incidents. Epic fail. And I see it all the time with huge companies. And when you have that text document, a criminal looks at that and says, "Hey, can I sell this on the dark web for a few $100? Or are these guys going to give me a few $1,000s for a bug bounty?" That's a no-brainer. So it encourages the bad guys to do the right thing, and it encourages the good guys. Now, I've seen over the years, like, bug bounties have just gone like this. Like, most companies are like, "Get out of here." And then, the third-party platforms, they pay so little that you're never going to get a good researcher, someone who's highly qualified. They're going to ignore three, four, $500. They're never going to waste their time because the top guys are already working on other stuff, and they're never going to give you the time. So you're doing yourself a disservice. And the good thing about a bug bounty is you can set anything you want in scope. Of course, nobody's like, "Okay, launch a denial of service attack." Of course, that's out of scope. Um, so, to summarize that, to not name and shame, but it does have to see the light of day when a company has a data incident, because companies have an obligation to their customers, to their partners, to their shareholders or stakeholders. And you're doing a great disservice to them by trying to sweep that under the rug, because at the end of the day, these are real people. And if those real people have their identity stolen or something like that, I mean, that's a nightmare for them to overcome. And they didn't do anything wrong. They just picked a product or a service, gave their data, and so the companies do have a responsibility.
Well, and it's interesting, and it's a bit ironic because one of the areas that, or one of the agencies that's really holding companies accountable is the SEC, because they want to know if there's funds that are being diverted either to pay a ransom or to make up for, like you mentioned, a DDoS attack. All of those different things obviously impact how the company's performing and therefore share values. So the issue we have in the industrial sector is there's a lot of small companies that we know are getting hit and not sharing that information. It leads to those hackers becoming more emboldened to continue to do those things, and also dwelling attacks where they're not kicking them out of their system. Chances are they're going to get hit again in 6 to 12 months. There's a lot going on there, which is why it's always interesting, and I've always pushed for companies to just be as transparent as possible, because there's a lot of resources out there, a lot of individuals like yourself on the good side, on the good team, that can help them out too once these problems come to light. So it's an interesting challenge that we continue to confront here on the industrial side. One of the things that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to go into another question, and what I was really talking about, you mentioned AI, and we know how the bad guys are using it. I've long been a proponent saying artificial intelligence is a great thing because we can use it for the good guys as well. We can use it on our side to become better in terms of our defensive posture as well as our response. I thought what was really interesting is when you look at the recent CrowdStrike bug and what was going on there, and there's been a lot of speculation that coding error could have been the result of AI writing code or being part of that algorithm to sort of predict potential hacker activity on some of the endpoints and things like that. So now there's this weird balance between how do we, sort of use humans to QA stuff, or should they be writing the code, or do we use AI to QA or write the code, or how do we sort of balance that out? And I'd love to get your thoughts there in terms of what are the best ways to use AI on the defensive side for the good guys.
Yeah, absolutely. The scariest part about this CrowdStrike thing, and I just put my head down. I was like, no way, I'm not touching that 10-foot pole. But the scary part is it has kernel access.
Yeah.
That's no good.
Right.
I mean, at least that's what the books say.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was the scariest part of that. And, they say the interweb is interconnected. I would say that was a huge learning lesson. With using AI for security side coding and development. Now, I've used it also. I mean, I know some basic C, PHP, just, some basic stuff that I've fooled around with, and I've made a couple little apps. But it's revolutionary in the way that you can test bugs with it. You can query errors, so it saves a massive amount of time. And one thing that we all learned from COVID when we were working from home, sleeping half the day and enjoying our lives for the first time, people realized how valuable time is, and anything you can do to save time. We are a shortcut culture now. I'm not blaming COVID for that, but we are a shortcut culture. You can lay in your bed and food comes to your door. You have so many examples of that. And AI will save time, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I do think you still need a human to review what's there, make sure that everything is functional before something goes live, or even in the development stage, it has to be human reviewed, and that takes time and that takes money. And these are the two things that companies don't want to give: time or money. So I think we'll see more and more of that. I think CrowdStrike learned their lesson, and this is about the third or fourth lesson for them. But it is what it is. And the thing that's so scary is, even me in this industry, I didn't realize that one update could wipe out half the world. I thank God I wasn't flying that day, but I have tons of friends that here in Europe were stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was crazy. And one of the things, on our staff, I got, the most understanding or knowledge of this particular topic, and we were talking about it, and it was like, were a lot of these organizations putting too many of their eggs in one basket, as you kind of used that analogy before. And my thought was it wasn't really that they're putting too many eggs in one basket, is that I don't think they understood all the eggs
Mhm.
that were in this basket to begin with.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the bigger problem that we see beyond just manufacturing, and it's into a lot of different industries, like we saw with CrowdStrike, whether it's the airlines, medical, whatever the case may be. And it feels like that just circles back to that real basic building block of visibility, and that continues to be such a challenge. I don't know.
Absolutely. And, having so many software applications, security applications, tracking and management applications, sooner or later you get this Frankenstein in your network. And the more points of vulnerability you have, you almost need a full-time person just for patch management. And because one vulnerability is a vulnerability in all, if you look at it in that respect. And so, yes, you need all of these tools. How do you segregate them? How do you segregate the data and make sure that if one falls, if your internal CrowdStrike falls, that it doesn't take the dominoes out with it?
Yeah. No, it's interesting, especially when you look at the industrial control systems and understanding all those connection points. And that kind of leads to one of the things I wanted to ask you about as well. And it's a loaded question because you could answer it either way. But in general, are we over connected right now? I know there's so many benefits from all these connections, but man, are we relying too much on it?
Yes, absolutely. And you just reminded me, I see control system logs all the time, millions and millions and millions and millions of them. Because they don't have PII or anything like that, I don't scan them because it's just not my wheelhouse. And, I would spend the rest of my life reporting them. But when you see these logs, either they're in error logs in like an Elasticsearch or a MongoDB. Um, Normally, those are where the logs kick out. And they're at risk too, because there's plenty of malicious scripts that come in. There was one a few years ago called MeowBot that went in and wiped all your files out and just renamed the file Meow. Like, so it was completely malicious. It had no purpose and, just wiped out your files. I guess, some cat enthusiast or, meme fan was feeling
Super Trooper super fan there or something, yeah.
absolutely. Oh, yeah, yeah, good reference. So I do see a lot of industrial logs, and because I've never fully analyzed them, this would be interesting. Now you've got me thinking, just to see what's in there, because I know it identifies middleware, and middleware is like that glue that makes your software work that doesn't work. And that middleware is a huge vulnerability, because you've got data passing through, and the logs, of course, they show your IPs, they show lots of other information. I mean, it's almost like I watch this like old CSI programs. Every database is like a crime scene. You just have to piece together all the facts and who did it and who it belongs to and where's the smoking gun.
Well, and that middleware is tough because it's so sticky and you just don't know what it glommed onto. And I think that is a case for a lot of those, again, these live off the land dwelling type attacks that we see in the ICS way too much. And I think it's because it is tough to see what it all connected to. Circling back again to that whole visibility thing. I don't mean to beat that into the ground, but that just continues to seems to show up in everything. So. Looking ahead here a little bit, Jeremiah, are there bigger trends you're seeing in the cybersecurity realm that we should really be paying attention to? We talked about AI, but is there some other stuff that's sort of lighting up your radar right now?
Most of my stuff is focused primarily on data breaches. That's my specialty. And in that space, even now, there's a lot of activity with ransomware, with, just nation states coming in and harvesting that data, and we don't know how it's going to be used later. And when I say that, so I've found numerous just massive data collections on Russian and Chinese IP addresses. So clearly they've collected quite a bit of data sets and housed them, and then they leaked the data that they harvested. And of course, there's nothing you can really do with that except for report it to the authorities, try to figure out, if the company that's hosting it is in a country that's favorable to, a takedown notice or something like that. So that's the real fear is if you are a company and you do have some intellectual property, and intellectual property is a broad definition. What damage could a nation state do with that? Could they clone the things you, especially in an industrial setting, like let's say you manufacture something, where's your blueprints? Here's the blueprints, here's the customer. Now we just took your business. And we know that our dear friends in the People's Republic would never do anything like that, but it's always a concern.
Well, and those hacks, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you can always reverse engineer them a little bit too. If you can start with the customer and work backwards with the way everything is connected right now, especially with supply chains, we've seen that as well, where it was the customer that got hacked and they used that to get into the retailer, the distributor, the manufacturer, and going from there. And any one of those links being vulnerable shuts everybody down. It's just a huge ongoing concern, and it really perpetuates that ransomware surge that we continue to see.
Yeah, and it's so easy to distribute malware, especially when you look at these, to take it back to this click balance discovery, 381,000 emails. And these are people who are in an industry that they service, or people who they had either marketed to, or at some point they were in contact with them. Now, that's a huge harvesting ground for spear phishing. And it goes back to what I was saying before. You can filter those emails and separate them by industry, by company, and then do further research. Like, let's say this person's a CTO, this person's a, CEO or whatever it is. And then once you figure out who they are, who your target is, you've got their information, you do a little open source intelligence research, and then you spearfish this person. And it's really easier than you would think.
Well, those email addresses too, half the time, in addition to just the Google search you can do and the amount of information you can find out there, that's typically half of the login. So when we talk about a lot of credential harvesting and these initial access brokers that are out there, in some cases they're going to be halfway home into getting into some part of your network, whether it's an email account or who knows what else it could be. When you look at remote access in the industrial sector and some of the things you alluded to before, it's scary, which is why a lot of these security protocols that you've discussed, double factor authentication, all those little things can go a long way in helping make sure they don't end up in one of your research reports, right?
Absolutely. Well, you're talking about double. It's, now you've got to deal with SIM cloning. So, and once you clone a SIM, now you have access to all of the social media accounts. You can reset passwords. What I'm finding for the last few years, it's really hard to find top executive email accounts. I mean, they don't want to be bothered with, an angry customer who didn't get something on time, something didn't meet their specifications. So a lot of times they hide this person's contact. So when you have that person's contact, that's much more risky. And like you said, it's almost always half of the login, half of the administrative credential. So once you target that email or target that person, I don't get into like the phishing aspect of it quite as much as I used to, just because I don't have time. I'm too busy looking at data. But, I've seen everything from cloning login pages and sending it to someone. One of the really popular things to do is, like, let's say you work for a company and criminals would buy a domain almost exactly like your company. And they use this, Cyrillic alphabet, the Russian alphabet. And so one letter looks exactly the same. They clone your login page, whatever. You type in your user credentials, boom, they got it. It's so easy. And that once again goes back to this human factor. I think the human factor still, with all of the technology, all of the artificial intelligence, that's going to be the biggest problem because we still have free will, last time I checked. And as long as we can click things and give out our social security numbers, there will always be a problem. That's the biggest fear I see going forward, and there's no easy fix.
100% agree. And just to add some credibility to what you just said, we're a less than $10 million B2B publishing outfit. We experience that type of sort of cloning or site dubbing or whatever you want to call it within our own little structure. It wasn't us, it was some customers of ours, but it's very prominent, and it doesn't matter how big you are, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. If they see a way to take advantage of it, it's going to happen, and just be aware.
Well, I have just an interesting tidbit of a story. I took down a Bitcoin scam operation of around 400 and something websites. This was maybe, like 9 months ago or something. So I had a friend contact me. They had been scammed. Their friend had been scammed. And what these guys were doing was they were building trust and buying brand name domains with like words like finance or Bitcoin or something. So it was like Tesla Bitcoin, Boeing Bitcoin. And the genius of that is they use, Google's turd algorithm against them, where if you searched for Tesla Bitcoin, good luck trying to find that, because Google puts all of these brands and these top media first. So you have to dig through 21 million layers before you ever see that a Nigerian scam Bitcoin site is using keywords, and basically they're domain squatting. And they use logos. They made it really, really, really believable. And they were scamming an unbelievable amount of people just using the trust of names. They were getting free SSLs. And so if you're a company like yourself, if you had a client do this as well, if you're a company and your brand is your business and someone clones that, what do you do about that, especially with Bulletproof hosting? In this case, I really went all out, but it was one of those rare times that I got to just test all the skills.
Yeah. Well, and I think the big thing that helped us is we became aware of it because we were careful, and we were able to at least alert people, and then pretty soon it kind of went away. They stopped messing with us. And I think that also illustrates the fact that the hacker is always going to take the easiest route. So if somebody puts up some line of defense and some resistance to it, it's not worth the effort anymore. They'll target somebody else. Don't like to pass it on to someone like that, but that's part of the process as well, making yourself tougher to deal with for the bad guys. So,
yeah, no one wants a victim that fights back.
Yeah, well said. Jeremiah, this has been fantastic. We're definitely going to have you on a little bit sometime later to talk more about some of these state-sponsored hackers. I know you've got some interesting experiences with there, but before we wrap things up today, two things. Number one, if folks are interested in looking at your work or reaching out to you, how can we get a hold of you? And I guess, do you have any other final parting thoughts for us before we sign off?
Yeah, so I'm always available. I've done lots of keynote speaking. I tend to think outside the box. I like to look at problems and try to solve them. So you can reach me the letter J, just J, at securitydiscovery.com. That's our research collaborative with my friend and partner, Bob Dyachenko. We worked together in Ukraine for many years. And so I'm always publishing my findings. I'm always looking for interesting things. And like I said, I've seen it all, from millions of credit cards to hospital records and everything else. And I call it big boy treasure hunting with a purpose. So that's my thing. The most important aspect to remember with cybersecurity is, as artificial intelligence grows, the challenges will only become more difficult. So the more roadblocks and doorways and protections you can put in front will really help you down the road. And being prepared, like I said, not proactively, but reactively, because it's not if a data breach happens, it's when it happens. And that's the most important thing to remember. Educate, educate, educate. get a mantra. I'll say this last part and then I'll close it out. Many times I see companies that have a data protection policy. One time a year, they're like, hey, sign this document. Nobody reads it. It's just blah, blah, blah. If you make it a living document and you really live by it and you make sure that each person in your organization understands that they are a data protector, they are, I am my data's keeper. And that's really important because you change the atmosphere, you change the culture. And when you change the culture, create a communication channel, do all the right things, you're prepared. And then you're 2 steps ahead of the game. You can never completely be secure, but the more steps you take to protect yourself, the better off you'll be. And that, my friends, is my final rant.
Thanks for the time, Jeremiah. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. To catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Jeremiah Fowler, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.